When families think about student loans, the first thing that usually comes to mind is to cover tuition. But the truth is, tuition is only a fraction of the cost of attending college each year. So what else can student loans cover, and what are they not allowed to be used for? In this video, I want to break down exactly what student loans can be applied to so that your student and you can use them wisely. Now make sure you hit subscribe, because every week I have a new strategy to help your family work towards a debt-free degree. Hey there, my name is Jocelyn Pearson, founder of the Scholarship System, where we help families overwhelmed by the cost of college help their students secure scholarships so that they can avoid these student loans. But that said, we need to make sure we understand if we're going to borrow, what it can be used for, what are the stipulations, and what we need to keep an eye out for. Now, our main weapon against debt is scholarships. That's our bread and butter. And we've helped families get over $16.5 million to date. And that's where I'd love for you to fall into. But that said, if we're considering loans, we need to know the ins and outs. Now, just a quick note, this is for U.S. citizens and permanent residents. I'm not familiar with the process for international students. Let's go ahead and jump in. So let's talk about the basics. What are student loans used to cover? And then we'll get into what they can't be used. So federal student loans are designed to cover the total cost of attendance. So colleges define this number, and it is much more than tuition. It really should include any kind of expenses that your student would have to face. This means that if your student takes out loans, that they can really use them for a range of education-related expenses, not just that tuition cost. Some common expenses that loans can cover include tuition and mandatory fees charged by the college. So a lot of classes will have their own fees on top of tuition. Room and board, so whether that's on campus and includes meal plans or reasonable off-campus rent and groceries, it can be used for that. Books and supplies, and this includes any kind of lab materials or software required for classes. Technology needs like laptop, printer, internet service, if that's required for coursework, which these days it will be. Transportation related to schools, so maybe a bus pass or a parking pass or gas money if they're commuting to campus. And then they're also allowed to be used for personal expenses tied to being a student. So laundry, toiletries, living costs. These are all factored into the school's official cost of attendance. So they really should have a total, this is the total cost that you will have to face. No surprises when they're figuring that number out. Now, here's what student loans cannot be used for. And it's important to know what's not covered so that we don't get in trouble, but they should not be used on things unrelated to education. This could be, for example, vacations or travel that's not related to school, like spring break. That does not count. Buying a car. So although transportation costs are allowed, car purchases themselves are not. And honestly, student loans are not where we'd be funding that anyway. We cannot use it for luxury things like concert tickets, designer clothes, expensive electronics that aren't necessary. And then they certainly cannot take this money and put it into investment or savings accounts. And we want to remember that we're paying interest on this money, so we should not want to use it on anything that's optional. Now, misusing student loan money can create financial trouble down the road. In extreme cases, it could even lead to legal issues. So again, this is why we have to make sure that we're doing it by the book. Now, hearing those categories, you can hear that the what is allowed is pretty flexible. It's quite a bit, right? And this is where actually families can kind of get into trouble, where we just borrow for everything. We borrow for rent, we borrow for food, we borrow for groceries, for gas, all these things, and we don't consider other ways to get money for covering those day-to-day expenses. I think this is where a lot of students can end up borrowing a lot more than they intended to. So if there's a way to cash flow that, or maybe get private scholarships, for example, to cover some of it, anything we can do to minimize what we're covering with student loans, that's obviously going to benefit us, because on average, it takes families, and I say families because parents are co-signing, on average, it takes 21 years now to pay off student debt. 21 years. And we're looking at average payments of $400+ per month. So that said, we want to try and limit what we're borrowing for if we can. Now, if you're considering private scholarships, which if you're considering student loans, you need to be doing scholarships, you need to be working through that process with your student, then you can go to my free webinar, thescholarshipsystem.com/free webinar, where I talk about where to find those scholarships, how to win them. And that is applicable to families with students as young as sophomore, juniors in high school, all the way through until they're a senior in college. So you can find the link to that free webinar below, or you can click on this video and you'll find all the info about it there too. And again, you can just go to thescholarshipsystem.com/free webinar. All right, let's keep moving on. So how are student loans dispersed? So if we've got our expenses, then how do we get the money to cover them? Typically, loans are sent directly to the college first. So the school applies the money to the bill, to the tuition, the fees. If we book housing through them, if we book meal plans through them, that will all be on a balance, on a bill. And students will have to click a button saying, yes, apply that student loan to these expenses. Anything that's remaining, so if your student borrows something that's in excess of the bill, that would be cut to your student in a check. And again, as you can probably hear, this can be a slippery slope. So it is refunded to the student. They can use that money as they need. Now, really, that should be for allowed expenses, right? Like books or off-campus living. This is where we need to be careful, right? So we should have a clear budget. We should budget wisely to stretch that payout of money for the whole semester. Even I got into trouble here where my first semester, I didn't realize I was eating out so much, even in addition to my meal plan. And next thing I know, I spent $1,000 extra than I realized. So luckily, I've always had like a serving job over the holidays or a part-time job or something. And so I was able to cover that without having to borrow money. But still, even someone who is financially conscious, it's easy to overspend, and this is where a budget can come in. Now, I do have an entire YouTube video all about financial disbursement, so you can click on that here, or you'll find the link in the description below. Now, this is important for parents. Talk to your student about borrowing wisely. So loans, they can feel like extra money when the refund hits the student's bank account, but we have to remind them it is borrowed money. And again, I've already spoken to, not only does the amount borrowed have to be paid back, but plus interest. In fact, we even have an entire playlist all about student loans showing how interest is calculated. If you want to watch those with them, have that discussion. For those that are members of the scholarship system program that we have, which is linked to in the description as well, we have our college cost calculator where you can actually walk through the budget with your student and show them, hey, if we borrow this amount, this is the kind of loan payments you're looking at. And that can help get their mind right. Whatever you think speaks to your student, to know the importance of borrowing only what they truly need. And I cannot stress this enough because, again, this is not just about borrowing some money and we'll pay it back in a few years. We're talking on average 21 years of paying it back. That interest is unforgivable, right? So that said, we can keep receipts and records of how money is used. So that's something that you want to discuss with your student. We also want to make sure that, treating any kind of loan refund, it's part of a very clear budget, that it's covering the projected expenses for rent, for groceries, for necessary expenses, not just spending cash. And again, this is why we focus on scholarships at the scholarship system. And you really need to check out that free training because we want to try to avoid having to borrow any of this. So, but comment below, what questions do you have about student loans? I'd be happy to record more videos explaining these. While it's not a sexy topic, it is necessary, especially if our students are signing the dotted line at 18 and signing up really for payments almost longer than they've been alive, right? So we want to make sure we're equipped for that. So that said, while tuition is the main focus of what student loans will cover, it really can expand to meals, transportation, technology, other essential college costs. And what they cannot cover are non-education related expenses like cars or vacations, travel, luxuries. So no matter what, this might sound like common sense, but you'd be surprised the situations I've found students in. And the key is making sure, again, that you're having these conversations with your student and you're ensuring that they are borrowing very carefully, spending with boundaries, focusing on the cost of attendance, and remembering that every dollar borrowed will not only need to be repaid, but plus some, right? Plus that interest amount. So I hope that was helpful. If so, give me a thumbs up and hit subscribe because every week we're going to have a new strategy for you on how to avoid these student loans. And again, don't forget that scholarship webinar because that's where you can start. All right, I'll see you next week.